Kuzampo, welcome to Bhutan e-learning program. I'm Topge. This is the biology lesson for Key Stage 4, classes 9 and 10. Today in this session, we are going to look at a very important topic about which we are quite familiar with. In this session, we are going to discuss about the things that we have been seeing around, the things in which we have been living in, and the things with which we have been interacting throughout our life. Let us look at some of the objectives that we are supposed to fulfill at the end of this session. All of us should be able to explain what ecosystem is. Number 2, state the components of ecosystem. Number 3, describe the significance of adaptation. So let us now look at what ecosystem is. I'm sure you would have seen a puddle in which there are so many insects or living organisms living, surviving, growing, and reproducing there. So that constitutes a puddle ecosystem, or maybe a water ecosystem in a broader term. You may have also seen such structure in the nature, a forest. This constitutes a forest ecosystem. Similarly, you might have also seen this kind of picture. What is it? You can say a grassland ecosystem, or maybe in botanist context, you can say an ecosystem in highland and alpine ecosystem. Then in the broader perspective, you could say that all the ecosystem can be summarized or put into one as an earth ecosystem. So now, having looked at all these examples of ecosystem, what do you think could be an ecosystem? How would you define ecosystem? Can you try defining what ecosystem is? Okay, ecosystem is a community of living organisms where you will have varieties of living organisms living together, and they would be interacting within the living organisms and with the non-living components of their environment. So these community where you find lots of living organisms living together and interacting with non-living components of an environment is called as ecosystem. What are the components that constitutes an ecosystem? Can you reflect back to the examples that we have already looked at? So generally, there are two components that constitutes an ecosystem. One, we call it as biotic component, and the other, we call it as abiotic component. The biotic component includes all the living things. So what are the living things that we have in nature? Okay, generally we have plants and animals as living things. So these two constitutes the biotic component of ecosystem. And on the other hand, we have abiotic component. So if plants and animals are constituting the biotic component of the ecosystem, what do you think might be there in a biotic component? So all the non-living things are included as a biotic component. So the non-living things includes the stone, the rocks, the water, minerals, air, and other conditions with which the living things will be interacting. So basically, in ecosystem, you will find that the biotic components and abiotic components are constantly interacting for so many reasons. The reasons could be to get food, for survival, for adaptation, and for reproduction. In order to better understand what each component does and what are the details of each component, let us look at the different components that are found in each component. So the first, as we have discussed already, is the biotic components. So the biotic component comprises of three broad categories of organisms. So those of the organisms which can prepare their own food, we call it as autotrophs. The examples of autotrophs are the plants. You already know that plants have the ability to prepare their own food. And the simple reason is because these plants can prepare their own food by using the resources that they have extracted from the soil through the roots, that is water and minerals, and then by the resources that they take in through the leaves. So in fact, the plants can prepare their own food by using carbon dioxide and water in presence of sunlight and chlorophyll. So such organisms are termed as autotrophs. So primarily, the plants depend on sun for the energy. That is why you may have also heard some people saying that sun is the primary source of energy. Sun provides energy to the plant. Plant in turn provides energy to the heterotrophs. But why? Heterotrophs are those group of organisms which cannot prepare their own food. For instance, you and I are included under heterotrophs. Likewise, the other animals such as tiger, deer, cows, and many more depend on plant directly or indirectly for the food, and these kind of animals we call it as heterotrophs. Then on the other side, we have the third kind of biotic components in the ecosystem, that is the decomposers. The decomposers include bacteria, fungi. So these organisms have the capability of breaking down the dead remains of an organism. For instance, you might have seen a dead dog near your garden. It remains there. After a few days, it smells. But after maybe 1 month, it disappears. How did it happen? Bacteria and fungi have the capability of breaking down the dead matters, the unwanted matters, into the form which can be reused by the plants. So now, let us look at the details of heterotrophs. Within the heterotrophs, based on the kind of feeding relationships the organisms share, the heterotrophs can be further categorized into 3 groups. 1 as herbivore, 2 as omnivore, and the third as carnivore. Now, what do you think could be herbivore? I'm sure you might have seen cow. Cow is an example of herbivore. So what could be the definition of herbivore? So herbivores are those organisms which depend on the plant. So can you think of some animals besides cow which feeds only on the plants? Okay, so you have deer, you also have sheep, then there is ox which feeds on the plants. So such animals are called as herbivores. On the other side, the animals such as tiger, lion are called as carnivores. So what could be carnivores? So carnivores are those of the animals which feed only on another animal. So in between these two, there is another group of animal which is both plant and animal. So what could be that group of animal? The omnivores. We have already looked at the decomposers. Decomposers are very much essential in making sure that the dead remains of animals and plants are removed from the earth. Every year you will see many animals and plants dying, but they disappear after some time. So this happens because of the action of decomposers. So the advantage of decomposers is, number 1, it helps in removal of dead remains. Number 2, it also helps in improving the fertility of the soil. And number 3, it also helps in nutrient recycling. So that is why the decomposers are important. But in short, these 3 autotrophs, heterotrophs, and decomposers constitute the biotic components of ecosystem. Let us now look at abiotic components. Abiotic components are those components, the non-living part. So the abiotic components includes the organic substances, the fats, the lipids, the proteins, and then you also have inorganic compounds such as carbon, nitrogen, then you have the sulfur, then you have the climatic factors which also constitutes the abiotic components. So the climatic factors include the temperature, the sunlight, the wind, and then the moisture content in the atmosphere. Basically, these abiotic components together provides a good condition, or maybe a condition that is not favorable for the biotic components to survive and live there. So it is because of the interaction within the abiotic components that allows the biotic component to choose the right place or preferable places for them to occupy, live, grow, and reproduce. So consequently, organisms, based on how successful the interaction that they can have between themselves and with the abiotic component, they choose different place. For instance, you would not see buffalo on the top of Duchola. At the same time, you do not see yaks at the foothills of Pinsoling. But what is the reason? Buffalo cannot live in cold place because the condition in cold place is such that the animals or organisms will require a mechanism to keep their body warm, which is lacking in the buffaloes. So that is why interaction between buffalo and the climatic condition and the surrounding, the abiotic factors, the buffalo is suited to warm places, while the yak, on the other hand, is made to adapt in the higher altitude. So accordingly, the organisms choose a place where they can live successfully, reproduce successfully, grow successfully, and that makes up what we call it as habitat. So what is habitat? Habitat, in simple term, is a home for living organisms. What does home provide? Home provides the food, it provides shelter, it also provides the other conditions that are essential, such as air and water. So accordingly, there can be different types of habitat on the earth. The habitat can be a forest habitat, so in which you will find a distinct group of animals. A desert habitat in which you will find a distinct group of animals. A river habitat or water habitat in which you will not find those of the organisms which live on the land. So a river habitat will have a group or set of organisms that are best adapted to live in water and reproduce. Now when we talk about habitat, we are not only referring to the plants nor to the animals only. So habitat refers to the place where all the living organisms, which includes both plant and animal, can live, survive, grow, and reproduce. So now, when the nature provides a very conducive condition where biotic and abiotic factors can interact successfully, it builds a habitat in which there can be a successful feeding relationship, which we could also call it as a feeding interaction. So what is that feeding interaction? You have to know that whether we are omnivore or carnivores, we depend on plants. But the only difference is herbivores depend on plant directly, while the carnivores depend on plants indirectly. For instance, a tiger eats deer, and deer without the grasses or plants will not be able to survive. And if the deer doesn't survive, the tiger will not have the food to eat. Assuming that there is only tiger and deer in the nature with some plants. So, tiger, while eating the deer, is depending on the plants for its survival. So in the nature, such setting will be built up in which a feeding relationship will be established. So based on the feeding relationship, a chain will be developed, which in broader term, you could call it as a food web. So now what could be food web? So food web refers to the representation of transfer of food energy from the source. What is the source? The plants. through herbivores to the carnivores. So that is called as food web. But the food web can be so complex that sometimes the energy from the source, that is from the plant, travels through deer directly to the tiger. But sometimes it doesn't happen in that way. You may find that the grass is taken by the rat is taken by the snake is eaten up by a hawk, and the hawk may be eaten by a wild boar if it is found dead, and the wild boar may be eaten by a tiger, and sometimes it can be so complex. But in short, what you have to understand is food web is the representation of transfer of energy from the energy source for the living things, that is from the plants, to the topmost level, that is the tertiary consumers, about which we will be discussing in the later part of the session. Now, within the food web, you will find such complexities. You find that there are so many arrows drawn here and there. It indicates that the organism can be eaten by another organism. In that way, a deer do not always remain as the food of a tiger. The grass do not always remain as the food for a deer. So that together constitutes what we call it as food web. Now, the smaller part of food web is the food chain. So what could be food chain? So food chain refers to the sequence of transfer of matter and energy in the form of food from one organism to the other organism. So that is called as food chain. But food chain is little simple than the food web. A tiger feeding on the deer feeding on the grass becomes an example of a food chain. In the same way, a snake eating the frog feeding on the wheat becomes a food chain. However, in the food chain, there are trophic levels, meaning the levels of energy. So at the lowest level, or at the bottom, we have producers, which is called as the plants. Primary refers to main. So therefore, the plant becomes the main producer of energy. So those of the organisms which eat the plants becomes the primary consumer. And then above that, there can be secondary consumer and tertiary consumer, as you can see here in the picture. So such relationships are being shared within the organism in an environment, and together it constitutes what we call it as an ecosystem. So as a result of such relationship, you will find that there are many kinds of interactions happening in the ecosystem, which we call it as ecological interactions. So now what do you think would be ecological interactions? So ecological interactions are those kind of interactions happening between the living organisms and with the surrounding environment for the benefit of both the parties or for one party. So accordingly, the ecological interactions can be of two types: the positive interactions and negative interactions. Positive interactions are those interactions where you will find that none of the participating organisms are harmed. All are benefited. On the other side, the negative interaction refers to those interactions where one is benefited and the other is harmed or killed. So let us look at each type in detail. Positive interaction comprises of two types of relationship: the mutualism and commensalism. So mutualism is a kind of relationship in which both the parties are benefited, while on the other side, commensalism refers to a kind of relationship in which one is benefited but the other is neither harmed nor helped. Let us look at the example of mutualism. You may have heard about pollination. Pollination requires the pollinating agent, such as bees, coming and visiting on the flower. And what kind of benefit do you see here in the pollination? Because you have already talked about pollination in lower classes. What benefit can you think of? In the pollination, you already know that the flower provides nectar to the visiting insects. So insect is benefited because it gets the nectar. But on the other side, the flower is helped by the bees in transferring pollen grain from anther to stigma, thereby letting the pollination to happen. So here, both bee and the flower are benefited. This is an example of mutualism. In the same way, you might have also seen a bird feeding on the tick or the flies that are found on the body of an animal, as you can see here in the picture. So here, how are these two parties benefited? The bird gets the food to eat, so there is a benefit for the bird. While on the other side, the animal who could not actually get rid of the flies and insects on its body has been helped by the bird to remove it. In that way, the animal is also helped. So this kind of relationship, we call it as mutualism. Then on the other side, we have commensalism. Commensalism is a kind of relationship in which one party is benefited, the other one is neither helped nor harmed. The example, one prominent example is the green coloration of the grasshopper trying to camouflage by using the grasses. What advantage does grasshopper get? It will be camouflaged, thereby the predators will not be able to see the grasshopper. While on the other side, the grass doesn't get any benefit from the grasshopper. Such relationship, we call it as commensalism. In the same way, in the sea, there is a fish called remora, which takes the help of shark to move from one place to the other by sitting on the body of the traveling shark. Here, the remora gets the advantage to travel from one place to the other, but on the other side, shark is neither affected nor benefited. So this kind of relationship, we call it as commensalism. Now what are we left with? The negative relationship. So the negative relationship is a kind of relationship that is shared between the organisms in which one is benefited and the other one is harmed or killed. So there are three types. One we call it as predation, other one we call it as parasitism, and the third we call it as competition. So predation, we have already talked about. A tiger feeding on the deer, snake feeding on the rat, bird feeding on the plants becomes a predation. The tiger in the example becomes a predator while the deer becomes the prey. So the prey is killed while the predator gets the food to eat. So that is the example of a negative interaction. Parasitism, it is the kind of interaction in which the organism lives inside another organism and gets all the food, nutrients, whatever it requires from the host, whereby the organism that feeds on the other organism, which is called as parasite, is benefited, while the other organism which provides all the required materials is affected. So the one which feeds on another organism, we call it as parasite, and the one which provides food, we call it as host. For example, lice on our head or on the body becomes a parasitism. So the lice becomes a parasite and our body becomes the host. So why do organisms compete? Organisms compete for resource, food, space, and for mate. So when they do not get enough food and space and partner, they have to compete in the nature. But generally, organisms are found competing for food and space. In such a situation, those of the organisms which are stronger enough takes the advantage and they win. And the other organisms which are weaker will not survive. They might become weak or they might be killed. So competition is not found only in the animals, but it is also found in the plants. You may have seen a huge number of seedlings growing in a place, but later you find that many of the seedlings has died, only few are surviving, and that is due to competition. So these are the examples of negative interaction. So, based on the interaction, or as a consequence of interaction, some organisms will be able to survive, while other organisms will die or move to a different place. The competition could also be from the nature, such as harsh climatic condition, drop in temperature, or maybe the drought, storm. All these will force the organism to go and settle in one place, which we call it as adaptation. So adaptation is the evolutionary process which allows the organisms to have a behavior that is heritable and to have a morphology or the physical form or a shape that allows them to stay, survive, and grow in that particular place. So that is the ability of an organism. Accordingly, the adaptation can be two. One we call it as structural adaptation, and the other we call it as behavioral adaptation. Structural adaptations refer to the change in physical part, as in case of yak with thick fur, as in case of buffalo with no fur, as in case of cactus with thick cuticle all over the body parts, and then leaves reduced in the form of a spine. So that becomes a structural adaptation. So in order to balance with the changing climatic conditions, you might have seen or heard about a black-necked crane, which has the habit of going back to Tibet during summer and then coming back to Bhutan during winter in order to escape cold climatic condition from Tibet during winter and then to escape hot climatic condition in Bhutan during summer. But the other behavioral adaptation that you could see is some animals, they stay in the group in order to search the food. Those of the weaker animals, they always group together so that they can protect themselves from other predators. These are the examples of behavioral adaptations. Before we wind up the session, let us quickly reflect back to what are some of the concepts that we have discussed in today's class. Number one, we have talked about ecosystem. So what is ecosystem? It refers to a community of living organisms where there is interaction within living organisms and non-living components. After that, we have talked about the components of ecosystem. Then we have also discussed about a habitat, the place where the organisms are able to live successfully, reproduce successfully, and grow successfully. Then we have also talked about the food web and the food chain. And then we have talked about ecological interactions, focusing on two types of interactions, the positive interaction and negative interaction. And finally, based on the interaction, we said that organisms will be able to establish themselves to a particular place, and that ability of the organisms to establish and then grow, reproduce, we call it as adaptation. So through adaptation, the organisms will also be able to find the required resources such as food. So before we end the session today, let me give you just 3 questions on which you will explore as your homework. Question number 1, can you imagine the situation of a world without the decomposers? Question number 2, look around, find an example of adaptation, and then discuss about what adaptation is. Number 3, you might have heard about the human-wildlife conflict prevailing in Bhutan. Please write down some reasons what might be causing human-wildlife conflict in Bhutan. So with this, I would like to thank you for attending this session. I look forward to having you in my next session. Until then, take care, stay safe. Thank you.